The geologic column. Let me lower this a little bit. Good morning. The geologic column, what does it reflect? Well, let's go to K33. This is in the arguments for and against creation and evolution. Let's begin by looking. We finished some viewpoints by evolutionists and creationists about the geologic column. And Dr. Don Patton summarizes what we talked about yesterday. He says, let's begin by looking at the geologic column, probably the most effective and persuasive argument made by evolutionists today. We're told that this is what you find when you dig it down in the earth. Beginning with the Quaternary up near the top, you find the modern animals, man and mammals. As you come further down to the Cretaceous, you find the dinosaurs. At the Triassic and the Permian, you've got the reptiles, and Pennsylvanian, the amphibians, and finally down to the bottom, to the Cambrian, the bottommost rock strata that shows any life forms, which all according to the evolutionary prediction should contain most of the single-cell organisms, when in fact you find virtually every animal phylum there, including the vertebrates. The biggest problem with this kind of representation is that you can't dig down into the earth and find it anywhere. You find it in the textbooks, but you don't find it in its complete form anywhere. Notice the statement by Leet and Judson in their book, Physical Geology, a textbook I was taught from at 2 different state universities. Because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all of Earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. Now, that doesn't make any sense. He affirms it's not in one place, it's a construct, pieced together, but there are varying opinions about this within geological circles. Dr. Patton goes on to say, if a pile were to be made by using the greatest thickness of sedimentary beds and of each geological age, it would be at least 100 miles high. It is, of course, impossible to have even a considerable fraction of this pile available at any one place. The Grand Canyon of the Colorado, for example, is only 1 mile deep. Van Engelen and Castor, the process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation, from the Latin for together plus relate. And we have now the process of correlation when it's based on rock formations is in a local area, works fairly well, but when that's ignored and it's based on fossils ignoring the rock formation, then we have some serious problems. Notice the statement by Derek Ager, who is telling us how this correlation process works. He says, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks in which they occur. Well, when you're building this complete column from worldwide sampling of fossils, it's done as a system of looking at the fossils and ignoring the rock units. Many people think it's done by the radiometric dating systems, telling which is older and which is younger. But that's not the case. He tells us very clearly that's not the case. Continuing, he says, I think of no cases of radioactive decay being used to date fossils. It's ages old, hasn't changed. I'm doing. Compare a quotation from Dr. Patton's notes. A rock that had an early form of an organism was clearly older than rocks containing later forms. Furthermore, all rocks that have the early form, no matter how far apart these rocks were geographically, would have to be the same age. Fossil successions made it possible today that the Cambrian rocks are older than the Ordovician rocks. I think that's how you pronounce it. In this way, our geologic timetable came into being. Without the theory of evolution and the interdisciplinary science of paleontology, it could not exist. It's a closed circuit, though. Hasn't changed for years. So the dating of the fossils is done rather on the basis of the fossils themselves. Well, how do the fossils tell us whether or not they ought to be top or bottom? Well, that comes from assumption of evolution, and you must begin with that assumption in order to build this complete column. So you assume your result before you investigate. I think we can see an obvious problem with the logic in this process as acknowledged by R.H. Rastall of Cambridge University. He says it cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical or logical standpoint, geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. Mr. Rastall says, and this poses something of a problem. If we date the rocks by their fossils, how can we then turn around and talk about patterns of evolutionary change through time in the fossil record? You've already concluded your answer. A circular argument arises. Niles Eldridge says, interpret the fossil record in the terms of a particular theory of evolution, inspect the interpretation, and note that it confirms the theory. Well, it would, wouldn't it? You've assumed it already. Tom Kemp, the rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. Well, how's that work? Stratigraphy cannot avoid this kind of reasoning if it insists on using only temporal concepts because circulatory is inherent in the derivation of timescales. But the danger of circularity is still present. The temporal ordering of biological events beyond the local section may critically involve paleontological correlation. For almost all contemporary paleontologists, it rests upon the acceptance of the evolutionary hypothesis. You have an hypothesis, you accept it as true, and then you investigate whether it is true? D.B. Kitts, they charge that the construction of the geologic scale involves circularity has a certain amount of validity. Thus, the procedure is far from ideal, and the geologic ranges are constantly being revised, usually extended as new occurrences are found. It's ever-changing. You don't change the textbooks. In other words, someone says, we have a primitive fossil here. This goes at the bottom of the geologic column. Well, how do you know this is a primitive fossil? Well, because it's found in an old rock. But how do you know that this old rock? Oh, well, that's because this is an old rock. Well, that's because it's got a primitive fossil in it. And with that kind of circular round and round type logic, obviously you have proved nothing. When you're looking at the geologic column, you see an illustration of the concept of evolution. But to use it as proof is entirely invalid. In order to force this column upon others as fact, you must begin with the assumption that it is legitimate to correlate worldwide the various strata that evolutionists presuppose form into this column. However, it is not found anywhere on the face of the earth, but in the textbooks it simply represents the assumption of evolution and not fact. How do we test this? Well, we compare it with the facts to see if they fit as we would models or hypotheses. Notice the statement of Richard Dawkins of Oxford in his book, The Flying Watchmaker, published in 1986. He says, if a single well-verified mammal skull would have turned up in a 500 million year old rock, our own whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. In other words, if you find something that should be at the top of the column actually down at the bottom, completely out of place, then it would refute this representation that we see in the geologic column. And he goes on to say, incidentally, this is sufficient answer to the canard put about by creationists and their journalistic fellow travelers that the whole theory of evolution is an unfalsifiable tautology. And it is. Much of the argumentation made for evolution is just that, an unfalsifiable tautology. For example, we hear arguments regarding the survival of the fittest. But when we define the fittest as those that survive, then we're really only saying the survival of those that survive. And this is a tautology. It is unfalsifiable and untestable. Much of the argumentation made for evolution is like that, but if you find things out of sequence, things that should be at the top, in the middle, or at the bottom, then you have a falsification. Continuing with a quotation, he says, ironically, it is also the reason why creationists are so keen on fake human footprints, which were carved during the Depression to fool tourists, in the dinosaur beds of Texas. Actually, they were proved to be real, with man prints in the middle, right in the middle of each footprint. Richard Dawkins says, well, they've heard about our work at Glen Rose all the way to Oxford, and they acknowledge the implications this would be sufficient to falsify the modern theory of evolution if these footprints, human footprints, were true. we can demonstrate that that's not the case, i.e. they are in fact genuine footprints contemporary with that of the dinosaur. But if you find bones, that's not nearly as important as finding the tracks. You see, the tracks cannot be eroded or redeposited. Here we see bones that were found in the same formation as Dinosaur National Monument in the Dakota sandstone, many dinosaurs perfectly, beautifully preserved, and here are two modern human skeletons. There's no question that it's human and that it's modern. They shouldn't be with the dinosaurs. According to evolutionists, they should be something like 100 million years apart. But the evolutionists falsely claim, without any evidence, that this was an intrusional burial. Automatically, it's assumed by evolutionists that this is an intrusional burial. They claim without proof, in other words, that the humans didn't originally die there, but were transferred there later by some unknown means, perhaps some scam. That's what they say. So you see that then the importance of the tracks. Let's go to Glen Rose, Texas. Here in the Paluxy River Dinosaur Valley State Park, we find many beautiful dinosaur tracks. But in addition to the dinosaur tracks, we also have tracks that look very, very human-like. A number of these tracks were found which continued back up under the banks of the river, which would not therefore be able to be carved as the evolutionist camp claims. Stan Taylor found a sequence of at least 6 human tracks in a right-left pattern that did not continue back up under the overburden, which was removed. Notice also the mud push-up surrounding the footprints, which argues strongly that this was not carved. It's real, because this couldn't be carved with such minute microscopic mud push marks around each toe in the foot. The dinosaurs stepped there first, a portion of it, the forepart, filled in with other material, and then the humans stepped in it, leaving the depression of his foot within the dinosaur track. Now the dinosaur, weighing a number of tons, made the initial impression, which was only an inch and a half, maybe deep. And then it was that material which was not quite as resistant that the humans stepped and left an impression. Now you can look on my website on the letter D for Dinosaur Tracks, and you can see the actual photographs of this. As some said, he just didn't carry enough weight to make a good impression with the normal substrate in the area, but let the dinosaur make the impression in order to walk safely in the animal's tracks, and since it is infilled with slushier type material like mud, he left a good imprint there also. So in the Taylor Trail, we have a double print. First, the dinosaur stepping, the infilled material accounting for the flush appearance of the dinosaur track, and then the human stepping within it later. As we consider this, we got some unexpected help from an unexpected source. Mary Leakey discovered a series of tracks in Africa, a series of clear tracks, a double track. One individual was stepping in the tracks of the other. Note that the fossilized dinosaur footprints found all over the world are best explained by a catastrophic worldwide flood and not by slow and gradual geologic processes over millions of years. You can click on this and you get the pictures of them. Just go on down to this website. Notice the statement by Russell Tuttle, who's professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago and with the Primate Research Center at Emory University. He says the third individual G3 footprint, you can go up here and click on it, carefully walked in the footprints of the second. He points out that the GWI hunters of southern Africa follow in the footprints of the person ahead in order to minimize noise and to protect their feet. It says overprinting would be a prudent habit. All right, R.H. Tuttle. And so this is documented to be not that unusual of a feature. In fact, when we notice animals walking along, cows follow each other, they step in each other's tracks. When we looked at the entire sequence of tracks, this is at Glen Rose, beginning down at the bottom, we see a right, left, a left, a right, and so on in order, up the trail. They're consistent. The rights are where they're supposed to be, the lefts are where they're supposed to be. In each of the 14 tracks we find at least a general human shape. Those shapes are very consistent in length. 7 of them reveal individual toes. And then when you look at it, cut it through, they cut one out and cut through it. They microscopically found that there were impression bubbles there. They were microscopic, couldn't have been carved. Now, none of Mary Leakey's show the individual toes apart from the big toe. In 12 of them, you can discern right from left. The right-left pattern is consistent all the way, every one of them, all 14 of them, one end to the other in Africa. And each of them is where it ought to be. And in the 110 million year old Glen Rose limestone on the same platform with literally hundreds of dinosaurs tracks, stepping in and across them